important and challenging conference. Important, obviously, and challenging because of the issues it addresses, but also important because I think it's crucial for people working in the humanities today to be able to have occasions to try to address issues that don't normally fall within their purview, but that are of obvious and urgent social importance, and also to show that a background in the humanities can be relevant and useful for bringing questions and problems and insights that aren't usually associated with these issues. And I take that to be one of the stakes in organizing this conference. When I was told that I had up to 90 minutes for this paper, I hadn't written anything at all, and I panicked, and I said, of course, I won't need anything like that. I won't have time to write anything as long as that. And of course, as it turned out, I'm going to come close to filling that, but I want to reassure you that the second half of the talk will have a great deal of visual elements. We'll be commenting a film, and then some photographs. And so that will hopefully make the time pass more quickly. The first part is then more theoretical, so we'll get that out of the way first. And there is a subtitle for this talk. It's called Clouds on a Possible Relation of Terror and Terrorism to Aesthetics. And yeah, this is something written for this conference. It's still very much therefore a work in progress. Now, it seems clear that the topic of our conference, although framed extremely broadly in the call for papers, is informed, consciously or unconsciously, perhaps even haunted, by a single series of images, which begins with a plane silhouetted against the blue sky, disappearing into one of the towers of the World Trade Center, and which ends, well, I'm not quite sure where it ends, or even if it has really ended. Perhaps its end, that day at least, was really only a beginning. In any case, the sequence of images reaches a certain culmination with the collapse of the towers into clouds of dust and rubble. Who, especially today, can avoid these images which have been broadcast incessantly on TV and most recently to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the event? What could be more vivid than these spectacular images of death and destruction? But what could also be more obscure? In what follows, I'm going to present some thoughts related to these images and to some other images that seem to me also to bear on our topic. I wish these thoughts could be presented in a more systematic fashion, that they could be more densely structured, more comprehensive and cohesive in character, and that they, above all, could come together to form a tightly knit and cogent argument. But I feel that I won't be able to pull this off today at least, and I beg your indulgence at the outset for their incomplete, fragmentary, and exploratory nature. Perhaps some of that can be compensated for in the discussion afterwards. When we speak of images, we here being both academics and also non-academics, we generally expect a certain transparency. Images are expected to show things, to reveal, to be windows onto the world in one form or another. This they surely are and do, but as the digitalization of images has recently emphasized, but it's in fact a thought that goes back at least as far back to Plato, the so-called transparency of images can also serve to conceal as much as to disclose. This is particularly so when we have to do with memory images. And yet, are not all images, in fact, memory images? If so, a notion elaborated by Freud can put us perhaps on the track of the complexities such images entail. I'm thinking of those memories that Freud called screen memories. In German, the term he uses is slightly different. It's Deckerinnerung, literally memories that cover or cover up. Such memories need not be based on perceptions. They need not even be images in the usual sense of that word, but they often are. Freud developed this notion based on the recurrence of certain very vivid memory images in the course of analysis. Images, however, which, as he discovered, served more to conceal, to cover up, than to reveal. In so doing, these images met the demands of repression, while at the same time concealing the gaps that would otherwise make such repression manifest and therefore less effective. The English translation of Denkerinnerung as screen memory is felicitous, insofar as it suggests this double function of the image as screen. First, to provide a support for representations and projections, and second, to screen out other images and elements that could disrupt the unity of self-consciousness and therefore fall prey to repression. I want to suggest that the questions of terror and terrorism, here and today, are linked to the series of images etched in all of our memories of those two planes striking the World Trade Center, setting it on fire, and ultimately causing the towers to implode into a cloud of dust. But I also want to argue that in the process of rememorization, precisely this sequence of images has often functioned as a collective, and sometimes even globally collective, screen memory, whose major function has been and continues to be to focus our attention on individual acts, actors, and events, while screening out other considerations, not just other images, but also other thoughts that might have and perhaps should have been aroused and explored in relation to this occurrence. This type of screening has been especially effective within the United States, where it enjoys the full support and collaboration of the mainstream media, particularly televisual. Media elsewhere, for instance in Europe and in Asia, have been far more critical, situating the images of 9/11 in a much larger historical and political context. But to the extent that the images of 9/11 have been exploited to justify a largely military response, namely the war against terror, this being only the most conspicuous aspect of this response, what I would call, adapting a notion of Walter Benjamin's, to which I'll return later on, what I would call the aesthetization of the image has been and continues to be a decisive factor. Now, when I speak of an aesthetization of the image in the media, I need to add an important caveat. The word aesthetics, like most other words, and especially terms that have a long and significant history, is overdetermined and ambiguous. It has sometimes signified the very opposite of what I will be using it as, taking my cue from Benjamin and Heidegger, but also from Paul de Man notion of aesthetic ideology and Philippe Lacoue-Labad's notion of national aestheticism. These last named critics associate the notion of aesthetics with concepts such as form and work. Now, I feel justified in using this particular tradition because of the power that has gathered around it and which has ramifications in areas far removed from its immediate applications, which is to say to art, beauty, and the sublime. Through this term of aesthetization, I want to suggest that a certain very powerful tradition of aesthetics has facilitated and even promoted the utilization and political exploitation of images as screen memories in the Freudian sense. Ever since Aristotle, and with many significant exceptions, such as Kant, this particular tradition has tended to screen out the screen function of images and to valorize it as a more or less neutral, more or less truthful window on the world. I use this phrase in full awareness that the restaurant that was on the World Trade Center, where I actually once had a meal, also had that name. It was this particular aesthetic tradition that Walter Benjamin had in mind when, in his essay on the work of art in the age of its technical reproducibility, he sought to develop an alternative to what he called the aestheticization of politics that he attributed to fascism. I will return to this question a little bit later on in this talk. But first, in order to understand how a certain tradition of aesthetics could contribute to what has been called a culture of fear, a culture that goes hand in hand with a politics that determines terror and terrorism to be its primary enemies, it will be helpful to introduce a second Freudian concept related to the first, even if Freud, to my knowledge himself, never linked these two concepts or discussed their relationship. This second concept has been largely overlooked in theoretical discussions, perhaps because, unlike screen memory, it makes use of an utterly banal and non-technical word that has nothing specifically psychoanalytic about it, and that perhaps was felt to be too familiar to catch anyone's attention or imagination. In contrast to screen memory, which Freud discovers and discusses very early on in his career, starting with an article written in 1899, the second concept is one he comes to late in life, discussing it at length only in his 1925 book, Inhibition, Symptom, Anxiety. I am referring here to the notion of isolation, which Freud introduces in that book in the context of his discussion of defense mechanisms developed by the ego, in particular in obsessional neurosis. In contrast to repression, which excludes representations from consciousness by replacing them with other representations or symptoms, isolation does not exclude representation from consciousness and hence from memory, but rather it does something else. It eliminates all the connections that could allow the representation in question to exercise a disruptive power. This is how Freud describes the process. I don't know if you've had handouts of the quotes. If you do, this is your first 5 quotes on the handout, but I'll read it slowly. Hopefully you can follow. Freud writes, when something unpleasant has happened to the subject, or when he himself has done something that has significance for his neurosis, he interpolates an interval during which nothing further must happen, during which he must perceive nothing and do nothing. The experience is not forgotten, but instead it is deprived of its affect, and its associative connections are suppressed or interrupted, so that it remains as though isolated. 2 points deserve special emphasis here. First, that what is deprived by isolation, what Freud calls its associative connections, relates to what he names as affect. He writes, I just quoted it, the experience is not forgotten, but instead is deprived of its affect. Isolation, therefore, which relates to experiences, does what repression cannot do according to Freud. Namely, it displaces affects. You may remember that Freud often insists on the fact that repression, in turn, relates only to representations, not to affects, which he insists cannot be experienced unconsciously and therefore cannot be repressed. Only representations can be repressed. Now, if Freud uses the word experiences here to designate the object of isolation, it's because here again he wishes to distinguish it from repression, which relates only to representations. Isolation, as we've seen from the quote, also relates to affects, but as a result, it also involves the body. As Freud puts it, it takes place in the motor sphere, which is to say, the interpolation of an interval during which nothing further must happen, as Freud puts it, which thus constitutes the movement of isolation. It must be understood not just as a mental event, but as a motoric one. Quote, the effect of this isolation is the same as the effect of repression with amnesia, but with a supplement. This is now the second quote on your sheet, short. Freud writes, it is at the same time given motor reinforcement for magical purposes. The elements that are held apart in this way are those that belong together associatively. The motor isolation is meant to ensure an interruption of the connection in thought. What Freud is describing here is situated, therefore, at the cusp between mental and physical, or rather, it tends to break down the clear-cut distinction between them. Nowhere is this clearer, but also more hidden, than in the verb he uses to describe the actual operation of isolating things, Things, he writes, that belong together associatively are held apart, in German auseinandergehalten, magically by the isolating interpolation. Why magic here? In order to designate precisely that the process described, although not consciously or deliberately willed, nevertheless involves an intentional act, and this in a double sense. First, in other words, the word magic refers to the particular kind of intentionality that is involved here. First, in order for something to be interrupted, as with isolation, its movement must be directional and at some level recognized as such. Isolation operates, therefore, by intentionally, although not self-consciously, interrupting the no less intentional, goal-directed, purposive movement of mind and body. It does this by inserting, Freud's German word is einschub, literally shoving in, something into the trajectory of the movement of the drive. However, since its primary function is to interrupt and to suspend, this insert can be entirely empty of content, and often is. It can consist in a blank space, for instance. It must simply arrest the forward thrust of the drive, nothing more but also nothing less. Nevertheless, in order for this isolating intervention to be effective, it must also have a certain duration or durability. The interruption must therefore consist in what could be called a holding action. Freud designates this more particularly, I've already quoted it, as a holding apart, auseinanderhalten. To hold things apart, however, one must first take hold of them, that is, make some sort of initial contact. This, however, creates a new problem. For according to Freud, isolation is motivated by what he calls one of the oldest and most fundamental commands of obsessional neurosis, namely the taboo on touching, end quote. Freud goes on to explain just why this taboo is so powerful. This is quote 3 on your sheet. If we ask ourselves why the avoidance of touching, contact, or contagion should play such a large part in this neurosis, and should become the subject matter of complicated systems, the answer is that touching and physical contact are the immediate aim of the aggressive as well as the loving object cathexis. Eros desires contact because it strives to make the I, my translation of what's usually rendered in English as ego, it's because it strives to make the I and the loved object one. But destructiveness too, which, before the invention of long-range weapons, could only take effect at close quarters, must presuppose physical contact, a coming to grips, literally in German, Handanlegen, laying hand on, handling. But isolating is removing the possibility of contact. It is a method of withdrawing a thing from being touched in any way. End quote. Now, Freud does not say explicitly just why or how the conflictual mix of erotic desire and aggressivity involved in touching should particularly give rise to something like isolating. But his reference to the ego, the I, suggests a possible response. The main task of the I is to organize and, if possible, harmonize and integrate the contradictory tendencies of the psyche, which, according to Freud's so-called second psychic typology, are located in the it, my translation for it, the superego, and the I. To the I falls the task then of bringing the largely divergent strivings of it and superego into some sort of unified, well-defined, and stable structure. Touching, however, embodies the impossibility of this task. It epitomizes what Freud elsewhere calls ambivalence, the simultaneous presence of urges that oppose or conflict with each other, above all the erotic drive for unification with the object or the other, and the aggressive drive to destroy it. One way the I tries to deal with these conflicts is precisely by excluding touching through isolating the antagonistic drives. If these drives can be separated and isolated, they may not conflict with each other and disturb the integrative function of the I. In a certain sense, and this will be important to us later on, isolation of the object, say of an image or a series of images, is desirable to the I because it reinforces the unity and stability of the I qua individual, literally as a being considered to be indivisible. Where touching takes place, by contrast, the limits of such indivisibility are compromised by contact, if not by conflict. Isolation thus attempts to institute and perpetuate a situation in which touching, that is contact and conflict, has become impossible. But if the only way the I can accomplish this task is by holding apart what otherwise belongs together, it has a serious problem. And for holding, and a fortiori holding apart, requires contact, touching, i.e. some sort of coming together. It's only by coming together then that one can hold apart. But holding apart is not simply touching, it is a touching in order to lay hold of, that is, to control, to fix into place. Now the problem faced by the I here is even more complicated. If it must touch the drives, desires, experiences, representations, in order to hold them apart, it must to a certain degree also be touched by them. For touching is never simply active or transitive. It's also simultaneously and inevitably passive. In touching the other, one is inevitably touched by that other. Touching, as Derrida, Nancy, and many others have remarked, is therefore necessarily ambivalent with respect to the established opposition and polarity of subject and object, self and other, active and passive. How the I then deals with these ambivalences becomes clearer when Freud relates it to an act that is not only part of the pathology of obsessional neurosis, but indeed is a major factor in the constitution of so-called normal, rational thought and behavior. This is quote 4 on your list. The normal phenomenon of concentration, Freud writes, provides a pretext for this kind of neurotic procedure. What seems to us important in the way of an impression or a piece of work must not be interfered with by the simultaneous claims of any other mental processes or activities. But even a normal person uses concentration to keep away not only what is irrelevant or unimportant, but above all, what is unsuitable because it is contradictory. He is most disturbed by those elements which once belonged together, but which have been torn apart in the course of his process of development, as, for instance, the ambivalence of his father complex in his relation to God. Thus, in the normal course of things, the I has a great deal of isolating work to do in its function of directing the current of thought. End quote. Insofar as one very important function of the I consists in directing the current of thought, it must first locate a goal in a stable, self-enclosed place toward which that current can then be channeled. The process of determining such a goal, concentration, entails for Freud, therefore, not just the positive activity of locating a place or an object, but simultaneously of stabilizing that place. Concentration thus touches its object, but since this object is initially situated in a conflictual force field of desires or drives, it can only keep it in place and retain its hold over it by separating it from the heterogeneous ramifications that in part constitute and determine it. Concentration thus touches doubly. It requires two hands, as it were, if it is to hold apart, which also means to keep apart what originally belonged together and what presumably, if left to its own devices, would stay together or come together again, albeit in a conflictual togetherness with one another. But concentration is mostly a cognitive activity. One concentrates on something in order to observe it better and ultimately to know it. Insofar as the process of concentration is understood as a cognitive process, it is experienced as mental rather than as physical, involving the body. If concentration touches on its object, this is generally understood to be merely a metaphorical way of describing its relation to an object that is considered to transcend the bodily limitations of spatial temporal situatedness. For concentration seeks to focus on the object itself, independently of its possible variations in space and time. As you've just heard, in English, but also in other languages, an often used synonym for concentration is the word focus. To focus on an object is to construe the object, the process of concentration by referring it to visual perception. Such a reference, however, is plausible only insofar as it is informed by an experience or conception of visuality that is culturally and historically constituted and therefore relative, not universal. However, this experience tends to regard itself precisely as universal and as objective, and this for in part internal reasons, for it consists in equating a particular mode of seeing with visuality itself. This particular mode of seeing consists in the interpretation of perception as essentially a mode of apprehending and recognizing objects construed as being self-contained and meaningful in order to be apprehendable. This object-oriented conception of visual perception divides the field of vision often into a duality of figure and ground, without questioning just how the field of perception is delimited in the first place. In other words, the framing of the field of vision is taken for granted as a given, in order that vision itself can be construed in terms of an internal differentiation between figure and ground, foreground and background. In French, this opposition is known as that between forme et fond. I mention this in order to introduce two of the words and concepts that will bear on our topic in this conference, or at least in my discussion of it, namely the notion of form and figure. These two concepts may not cover the entire realm of aesthetics, but they certainly inform the interpretation that has related it to art, beauty, and sublimity in the Western tradition. A form, as Kant writes in his critique of the power to judge, is where the concept of form, despite playing a decisive role throughout that text, is never really elaborated. A form, according to Kant, is constituted through the unifying synthesis of a manifold in its singularity, i.e., without recourse to a general concept that, qua general, would be external to the aesthetic experience, insofar as, for Kant at least, this experience cannot be separated from a singular encounter and representation. Although through this insistence on singularity, Kant's interpretation of the aesthetic is distinguished from that of his illustrious predecessors, such as Baumgarten and Winkelmann, he retains the notion of form and tries to reconcile it precisely with the singularity of aesthetic judgment. One of the concrete points of divergence that separate Kant from his predecessors has to do with the significance of the human body as the site of what is called the ideal of beauty. This goes back to Winkelmann, who insists on the aesthetic qualities of the human body in Greek sculpture as an object of representation. Kant rejects this aesthetic privilege of the human body precisely because it would impose an objective ideal of beauty on what for Kant has to remain tied to a singular and subjective experience. This is also the reason why Kant subordinates artistic to natural beauty in his discussion of aesthetic judgment, not because he prefers landscapes to people, but because he wants to safeguard the singularity of the aesthetic encounter from being contaminated by any sort of conceptual generality. And this would be the case, inevitably, for him at least, in the encounter with artistic beauty, since the latter would always be understood as the realization of a prior intention of the artist that itself would be of a general or generalizing character. The artist has something in mind which then is realized in the beautiful work. Without being able to discuss this question in further detail here, suffice it to say that in Kant, the notion of form tends to unravel in the third critique in the face of his continued insistence on the singularity of the aesthetic encounter, and that for this reason, Kant can be seen as inaugurating a distinctively modern tradition of aesthetics, which, while seeking to perpetuate its more classical claims to unification and harmonization, also opens aesthetics constitutively to conflict and to struggle, a line that then will lead more or less directly then to Nietzsche. Benjamin, Heidegger, Derrida, Nietzsche are just some of the more influential modern thinkers who have read Kant in this way against the grain of his own systematic intention. Perhaps more as a thinker of unresolved conflicts and problems than of unshakable foundations. The pre- and post-Kantian identification of the human body as the epitome both of the aesthetic object and of bodies per se has a long history, which I cannot begin to unfold here in any detail. I'll just go on to say that it seems to me that in today's discourse about embodiment, very often at least, this very classical, what I would call oncotheological notion of the body continues to be determinant. This history, which I can't go into, has to be mentioned, however, since it remains, I want to argue, also the implicit precondition of much of what is experienced as terror today. Suffice it to say that much of its emotional force of this tradition is grounded in a tradition informed by Christian theology, for which the human form and body is the site both of the most extreme suffering and violence, and yet because of this also of the possibility of resurrection and restitution. Deriving both from the biblical account of human beings created in the image of their Creator, and from the Christian account of the crucifixion and resurrection of the Son of God, the human body emerges as the site of suffering, but also of salvation, often reconciled through the notion of martyrdom. Plays obviously an important role in the question of terror and terrorism. Not strictly in a Christian context, of course, but in a biblical context. What I want to suggest is that although this salvational potential is associated particularly with a certain view of the human body, the latter accordingly provides the basis upon which all bodies are then construed. In other words, a theological model informs an aesthetic paradigm that in turn serves as a criterion for how reality is or should be understood. Put simply, and surely too simply, if the universe is conceived of as the creation of a self-identical and exclusive deity, then all aspects of that universe are meaningful and valuable insofar as they reflect the process of their origin. Aesthetic objects are thus understood as products of creation, a word that continues to be used in a secular context, but which I believe retains the theological structure from which it derives. Creatures derive their life from their creator. Art objects derive their value from their artistic creator. Objects in general, according to this paradigm, have being insofar as that being is the product of an originating intention. This is the attitude that informs also Christian fundamentalist views of the universe as the product of what in the United States is called intelligent design, rather than of the aleatory process of evolution. The fact that contemporary science increasingly emphasizes the aleatory, not just in evolutionary theory, but also, for example, in quantum mechanics, far from eliminating theological and teleological conceptions of reality, can, as we see, actually provoke and promote them, in part as a reaction to a worldview that provides little consolation or solace for everyday anxieties and suffering. The ostensibly secular aesthetic notions of form and figure are traditionally associated with this teleological view of the world, even where they seek, as in Kant, to take their distances from it. Kant's famous formula for the aesthetic judgment of the beautiful as purposiveness without purpose reflects this link even while subjectivizing it. Why, however, should notions of intelligent design, and more generally the belief in some sort of transcendent intention pervading the world, help to assuage such anxieties and concerns, and thereby continue to impose themselves, at least in the United States, on large portions of the population in the face of the near universal opposition of the scientific and intellectual establishment? Perhaps because the very notion of intention and design implies the ability to overcome the uncertainties that spatial temporal experience inevitably entails for living beings, and in the contemporary world increasingly for the majority of them as the socioeconomic conditions of life become increasingly precarious, especially, but not only, in the so-called developed nations. The realization of a plan or a project implied in notions of intention or design can be seen as embodying the power to overcome such anxieties and concerns, especially wherever traditional modes of survival through work, for instance, seem increasingly uncertain. The tension in cultures that are informed by the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what it's called in the Declaration of Independence, on the one hand, and the reality of ever more precarious conditions under which that life must be lived, seems to produce an increased desire for systems of belief that would guarantee what society no longer does. Now, an aesthetics of form and figure, an aesthetics of representation, and here the connection of all of these remarks with our topic will hopefully begin to re-emerge. An aesthetics of form and figure also can and does respond to this desire, especially when that aesthetics serves as a model according to which reality can be construed and conceived. What Carl Schmitt, back in the 1920s, in a short book entitled Roman Catholicism and Political Form, called the principle of representation, in which he located the distinctive political significance and power of the Catholic Church, dominates the televisual media today in the United States, but also in many other parts of the world. This principle of representation that Schmitt saw epitomized in the crucifixion, in which the mortal human body is promised a resurrection through suffering, provides a view of the world in which terror and terrorism and violence more generally can appear as necessary passages toward salvation. This is not to say that such an effect is the only one that such sacrificial representation can produce, but only that a long and deeply founded tradition seeks to demonstrate a connection between death as punishment and salvation through sacrifice. It is through a certain form of representation, through representation as the formation of form and at the same time as its transcendence, that such a salvational process can be embodied, as it were, in a world in which finitude is considered essentially to be punishment for sin. Representation thus represents what is never directly accessible. It makes the invisible visible, the unimaginable vivid. I should add that for Schmitt, the principle of representation in this sense is not primarily aesthetic, but legal. It is not aesthetic form, but legal formalism that anticipates the passage, or rather the leap, from the finite to the infinite, from the mortal to the immortal. His argument can also, I believe, be applied to the use of aesthetic forms and figures, especially where they are not intended to portray beauty as such, but reality. If one follows the previous argument that it is the sacralized individual human body that informs the conception of reality as such, then the use of images can be no less potent than legal formalism in providing or supporting a belief system that claims to link the finite to the infinite. Schmitt's emphasis on legal formalism over aesthetic form in outlining his principle of representation surely has to do with the spiritualizing abstraction of such form, by contrast with the corporeal nature of the aesthetic. But precisely because of its intimate relation to bodily individuation, images precisely can figure, and have figured, that reassuring promise of sacrificial self-redemption. The self being tied to the individual being tied to the body. To be sure, such figuration will always retain an element of ambiguity and uncertainty, given that its claim to transcendence is necessarily tied to the representation of immanence. And it is here, perhaps, that the function of the cloud can enter the picture, or rather of clouds, for there's almost always more than one. Or rather, the unity of the cloud is never stable or assured, which is part of what allows it to seem to bridge the gap between the world of finite space and time, the world of the figure, and the beyond. This is perhaps also why clouds often seem to conceal something like a secret, and even a certain violence that can both terrify but also console. In the time remaining, I want to look at two very different and yet unrelated not unrelated instances of clouds, in which a certain aestheticism converges with terror and terrorism, albeit in very different ways and at very different historical moments, but moments which I believe are related. So that's the theoretical part. Now comes the image part. I can close the curtains and so Okay, the first instance now of these clouds is to be found in a film dating from 1934. I'm speaking of the opening scene of Leni Riefenstahl's film, Triumph of the Will, which documents the Nazi Party rally of that year, held in Nuremberg. It's not exactly the opening scene, however, because as you'll see, there's a kind of prologue that precedes it, which I will also spend a certain amount of time discussing. So, maybe we can show then the prologue and the part of the first scene, not the entire first scene, of Triumph of the Will. YouTube, free. So if any of you are interested in seeing how it turns out, speaking of how it turns out, I don't think I mentioned this in this talk, but if any of you have seen Judgment at Nuremberg by Stanley Kramer, with Burt Lancaster in the role of an accused Nazi official. It begins with a dynamiter, the very first scene of that eagle that we see. So it's a kind of both a response and a tribute to his predecessor, I think, and I interpret it that way, this eagle, which occurs at several points in the film. Okay, Riefenstahl's film, together with Olympiade, made 2 years later at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, are almost universally characterized and classified as propaganda films. Riefenstahl herself rejected this characterization, pointing out that in her films there is no voice off telling viewers what they should think or how to respond. There were simply the images and sounds of what was being filmed, accompanied by a musical score. Now, it's true that the musical accompaniment obviously contributes powerfully to producing an ambience, which in turn profoundly influences and indeed often dictates the way the images are understood by the spectator. The influence of such musical accompaniment is all the more effective for passing under the radar of our conscious control. We're generally far less aware of the music than we would be of a spoken discourse. However, I find her remark, just parenthetically, about the voice off extremely interesting. And if you, for example, think of the voice off in the nightly news, the television news, and if you compare cases, for example, where you see images without a voice off telling you what you think, for example, the last 5 minutes each hour of Euronews, where you have no comment, for instance, you see how important the voice off actually is. And it's also something you tend not to think about because it's very often a voice off. It's not for nothing that the presenter of the news, nightly news, is called in American English an anchor person. Because that the presence of the image and voice of the speaker anchors what otherwise could, I would interpret as an uncontrolled or a much more ambiguous chain of signification that could be attached to the images. Okay. So this is not an uninteresting response on the part. Nevertheless, then, it remains accurate that the only voices heard in the film are those of the participants. The speeches of Hitler, Hess, other Nazi dignitaries are carefully edited, of course. This means that if there is a propagandistic element to this film, it has to consist in the images and sounds rather than in an invisible and transcendent voice telling viewers what those images and sounds really mean. There is, however, a partial exception to this rule, a significant one, and it comes right at the outset in the credits, as it were, that introduce and frame the film. This English term, credits, however, hardly does justice to what in German is called the Vorspann, and what in French is known as the générique. I prefer the latter term because despite its utilitarian meaning, that of listing the people, the genre, générique, involved in the production of the film, the word can also suggest that what comes before the film proper, in a certain sense introducing it, also can generate the film, générique, by framing the context in which it is intended to be seen. Now, although the générique or prologue does not involve a voice in Riefenstahl's film, it makes explicit use of writing and inscriptions and the image of writing and inscriptions, indeed of typography, in order precisely to introduce the film and to set the scene. The film begins significantly not with an image, this you could barely see because the room isn't dark enough and it goes very quickly, but the film begins with the negation of an image and visibility, with a black screen that's there for about 2 seconds. The first thing that you see is a black screen. It's dark. which can also be interpreted as representing night or darkness. Throughout the film, however, the play of light and dark, the emergence of the one out of the other and its passage into the other, turns out to be one of the most salient hallmarks of the film, visually. But this dark black screen doesn't last for long. It functions as an introduction and contrast, as a transition to what is to come. After barely a second or two, this darkness slowly lightens, allowing a figure to gradually emerge, that of an ego, sculpted in stone, perched on something, the camera is descending, that at first is not recognizable, but that in the seconds that follow the descent of the camera is silhouetted against a background consisting of bright clouds quickly moving across the sky. These clouds thus do not obscure sight, but rather provide a bright background that sets off the massive figures of the ego perched on a wreath, which in turn encloses the Nazi symbol par excellence, the swastika. Already in these initial seconds, then, the viewer is confronted with a set of contrasts that will pervade the film as a whole. Between dark and light, between stasis and motion, between the visible and the invisible. Of these contrasts, it's the one between stasis and motion that is perhaps the most significant, because in a certain sense, it's presupposed by all the others. The rally that Riefenstahl is filming is one not just of a political party, but of one that always referred to itself as a political movement, Bewegung. Riefenstahl, who asserted that she had introduced the traveling shot into the documentary film here, was in any event fully aware of the importance of movement and of the fact that such movement had to include that of the camera and of the spectator. Her films were designed to move their viewers, and to do this, they both depicted certain kinds of movement from a perspective that itself was highly mobile. The scene that we just cut out there at the end then shows the procession of the Führer through the crowds, and often with the camera behind as well as on the side. So you have different shots of the movement, the camera being part of the movement as it was in the plane, but looking over the shoulder, as it were, of Hitler. And then cameras placed elsewhere to watch the going by, the relation to the crowd and so on. This relation between movement and stasis, between change and duration, also pervades the film, both in what it shows, in the way the camera itself moves, and in the speeches of the participants. But all of this movement is framed at the outset by the manner in which the credits are presented, or the film introduces, not just credits. This introductory framing consists then of 3 sections, lasting about 30 seconds each and separated by fade-outs. The first we've just described, it proceeds from the dark screen to progressively illuminated ego perched on a wreath framing the swastika, and then finally, in a descent, descending to the title, Triumph of the Will. The inscriptions are all carved out of stone, as if set on a wall, which in turn is made up of large square blocks. The inscriptions are in semi-Gothic letters, the materiality of which is emphasized by shadows that they cast on the wall that is their support. The notion of a 1,000-year Reich, although nowhere mentioned explicitly in the film, is thus suggested by this massive stone lettering, which is, as it were, designed to withstand the passage of time. But in fact, there are 2 kinds of fading in this first section. The fading of one image into the next, establishing a continuous transition, and then the fading into a black screen that separates the sections from each other. So within a section you have kind of fading black, one image to the other, and between the sections, the black screen. This fading to black can be interpreted as the interpolation of the interval required to separate individual elements from one another. The images are, of course, related and therefore not isolated in the Freudian sense, but the fading gives each segment a relative independence and autonomy. Each image inscribed in stone letters is intended to withstand the test of time. These images, beginning with those of the inscriptions, are designed to last. This temporal dimension then emerges clearly in the second and third sections of this introductory sequence, both of which then unfold and name a certain history. First, the history of the film itself. Riefenstahl calls it a document, as in documentary. It's been called into being, quote, at the behest of the Führer, im Auftrag des Führers. Unfortunately, we didn't have the subtitles there. But I'm going to quote it so that you see that the film document is made im Auftrag des Führers, at the behest of the Führer, which gives it, of course, a special privilege and proximity with respect to what is being filmed. But the next screen announces that the film, which has been called into being, as it were, by the Führer, has been shaped by Leni Riefenstahl. That's where her name appears. The English subtitle, which you didn't see, uses the more familiar word created by Leni Riefenstahl. But the German is more precise and more limited. In German, it's gestaltet from Leni Riefenstahl. The word Gestalt is significant, for it does not imply a creatio ex nihilo, or in this case, a creation emanating strictly from the artistic creator, but rather a shaping that gives form and figure to a material that already exists, and in this case emanates from the task assigned by the Führer. Now, much has been written about this notion of Gestalt, especially in the wake of Heidegger, who sees in the term an essential aesthetic concept contributing to the metaphysical forgetting of the ontological difference between being and beings. For Heidegger, the word suggests something that is constituted independently of time and history, and that can determine the course of both. A similar claim seems to be inscribed in the stone-like lettering of these credits, which seek thereby to accredit the idea of a title and a name that will be impervious to temporal change, and that will also contribute to channeling and directing the course of history. The four screens that constitute the third and final section of the introduction deploy the immediate historical sequence in which the film and the events it documents situate themselves. This is done through a series of dates, beginning with September 5th, 1934, the first day of the Party Congress. Heidegger assimilates the notion of Gestalt to a metaphysical tradition that construes being, above all, in terms of the third-person singular, present, indicative, reducing its resources to simple self-presence of the is. Riefenstahl's dating confirms that reduction by situating the moment in which the Party Congress begins with respect to datable historical antecedents. The first of these dates is described as 20 years after the outbreak of the World War. The second locates the rally 16 years after the start of German suffering, that is the Treaty of Versailles. And finally, as though to indicate the acceleration of historical time, the years change to months, 19 months, after the beginning of the German rebirth, marked by a shift also in musical accompaniment to a kind of pseudo-Wagnerian swelling brass fanfare, i.e. 19 months after the naming of Hitler as Chancellor on January 3rd, 1933. 19 months after that date, and also after all the other dates, another arrival, another event is going to be shown, which is this time that of Hitler arriving by plane in Nuremberg. Now, before we proceed to that sequence, it should be noted that the tripartite division of the historical process leading up to the 34-party Congress can be, I believe, usefully compared to the tripartite division of the Christian salvational narrative, in German Heilsgeschichte. If the latter consists of first creation, then fall, and finally redemption, 20th century German history, as announced in this film, traces a similar pattern, formally at least, with several illuminating changes. In place of the creation of the world, there is the world at war. In place of the fall, there is the defeat and the suffering that it introduced, a certain type of peace treaty. And finally, in place of resurrection, there is rebirth through the coming to power of the Führer and his party. What the film, however, will share with the Christian salvational narrative is then the idea of a fall leading to redemption and rebirth, and also the focus on an individual messianic figure as primary agent of the salvational process. The place, however, of the Christian emphasis on charity is now taken by the unabashed commitment to and exaltation of struggle, power, and violence. Hence, the importance throughout the film of militarization. To triumph, the Nazi will requires nothing more nor less than the militarization of the masses. And this, as we see, or as we shall see in the scene I'll show in a while, involves forging them into a uniformed block, into what I would call a mass or massive Gestalt. This is already implicit in the style of inscription already discussed. It consists in the literal sense of the German word in something like Blockschrift, blocked writing, a writing composed literally of stone blocks. Written in stone is also a German expression that designates something held to be immutable. That's precisely what is at stake here. Christian salvation becomes political, and something is missing here. And in the form, it becomes political in the form of national immutability. This does not exclude change, to be sure, but it absorbs and instrumentalizes it. There's a second point, however, in which the historical narrative suggested here at the outset differs from its Christian origins. The salvation to come will not take place essentially in heaven, but right here on earth. And it will take place, in a certain sense, here and now, on a particular datable day, which marks the fourth and last date in the sequence, and also the transition from the prologue to the film proper, namely September 5th, 1934, the day that the film itself begins, and the day we read the final inscription on which Adolf Hitler flew once again to Nuremberg to muster the faithful. That was barely visible here. In German, Umherschau abzuhalten über seine Getreuen. The German, difficult to translate in its nuances, to hold a military display is hardly adequate. That was the English translation. To muster his faithful troops brings together the Christian ideal of the faithful, literally his faithful, seine Getreuen, with the political notion of mustering, military notion, again literally reviewing or inspecting the troops, Heerschau. For all of its momentous presence, Hitler's voyage to Nuremberg, however, was explicitly designated in the preceding inscription as a return. Flog wiederum nach Nuremberg. And this return is highly overdetermined. Most immediately, it recalls that this is a second coming. It's the second time that Hitler and Riefenstahl have gone to a party conference in Nuremberg. 1 year before, Leni Riefenstahl had already filmed the 1933 party congress there, which was released under the title Triumph of Faith, Triumph des Glaubens. For the second time, however, faith has now been replaced by will, and this in a very particular sense. For only 2 months before this rally, the most faithful, perhaps, and certainly oldest part of the Nazi party apparatus, which had served as its armed wing throughout its struggle for power, namely the SA, had been decapitated in what came to be known as the Night of the Long Knives, but which the Nazis themselves referred to, and it's still often referred to that way, as the Wurmputsch. Ernst Wurm, head of the SA, represented the radical, more socialist wing of the National Socialist Party. And for him, as he declared after 1933, the seizing of state power was only a step and a means to the institution of further-ranging anti-capitalist socialist changes, or social changes. In short, for Wurm, the National Socialist Revolution had only begun with the seizure of power, whereas for Hitler, it had become imperative to normalize the power up to a point so that it could consolidate its rule with the help of the Reichswehr, the army, and with the help of the barons of German industry and finance. In 1934, therefore, the triumph of the will also meant the triumph of the SS over the SR, of Himmler over Wurm, of normalization over revolution, right-wing revolution. Given the historic role played by Wurm's SA, however, in the rise of the Nazi Party, the question of who the true faithful really were, the Getreuen, had to be very much on everyone's mind. The return, therefore, of the Führer to Nuremberg is also the moment when he will muster his troops, hold that Heerschau, to make sure that he still commands the loyalty of the some 4 million members of the SA, whose leadership he had eliminated barely 2 months before. And the moment of rebirth can also be understood, therefore, to mark the elimination, the violent elimination, execution, of the radical, proletarian, social revolutionary wing of the Nazi Party, which now faced the task, as I say, of consolidating its power with the help of the German military and industry. To be sure, watching the movie today, none of this background is immediately visible in the images and sounds filmed by Riefenstahl, although many, many allusions to these events are made in the speeches of Hitler and the party functionaries. But shadows and clouds through which Hitler will fly in arriving at Nuremberg also suggest the dangers he has recently sought to overcome. None of this is explicit, but in the initial context in which the movie was made, they provide the background against which the images would be seen and heard, at least by a contemporary audience, in Germany at least. This is also why the clouds that first surround the plane in flight, and into which it then descends, losing sight of both the sky and the earth below, are finally traversed and then allow the rooftops of the city below to come into view. The plane is both a product of technology and an instrument of power. And this is perhaps why Riefenstahl includes the plane in the images and sounds that she shows. The film and the vision it presents is made possible politically as well as technically only by the power of this relatively new means of transportation, which is part of the same technological development that produced the film camera itself. Technology records and transmits, and in so doing can be seen as transcendence brought down to earth. This is also why Riefenstahl will proudly claim to have introduced the traveling shot into documentary film. It's not enough to film movement or to film moving pictures. The camera itself must be on the move, although, for instance, in a very different way from G. Vertov's Man with the Camera, which would be interesting to compare. After panning across the clouds, plane and camera descend slowly into them, as I say, briefly losing view of the sky before suddenly showing the roofs of Nuremberg emerging below. The clouds have provided a reassuring protective cover for the descent from the sky to the earth. Towers appear, first of the cathedral, then of the castle, emblems of church and state, contrasting with the darker, modern, inchoate forms of the airplane fuselage we have just peered through, but also at. You even see the rivets if you have a good projection of it. As the plane descends ever lower and the details of the rooftops emerge more clearly, the sort of anodyne musical accompaniment dominated by strings is suddenly replaced by brass and woodwinds playing the music of the horse wrestle song, Die Fahne hoch, anthem of the Nazi Party. The song was named after and composed by a member of the SA, who was subsequently killed in street battles with the Communist Red Front. As the music of this song is heard, the scene shifts from houses to blocks of people marching in the streets, an image that echoes the first lines of the song, which we hear, the music, not the words, namely in English translation, with flags on high and ranks in tight formation. SA is on the march with brave, determined step. My translation is the spirit of the Germans insist. It is the formation of these ranks, however, tightly closed, die Reihen fest geschlossen, as the German says, that epitomizes one essential aspect of the images seen in this film, and which is also to be remembered as a hallmark of depictions of fascism more generally. What I'd like to point out, however, in the context of our conference, is that there is a connection, I believe, between the fascist and Nazi emphasis on unity, uniformity, and homogeneity, and what Kant, who's not responsible for this, once defined as the formal element in an aesthetic judgment, which I've already quoted, and which involves the unification of a manifold or a multiplicity. The massed blocks of marchers, whether civilian or military, create that uniformity that is already, I want to argue, prefigured in traditional aesthetic concepts of form and figure and Gestalt. I want to make sure that it's clear what I'm suggesting here. What I'm suggesting is that something like fascism and Nazism could only have developed the power that it developed if it were able to mobilize for its purposes elements that are deeply, deeply ingrained in traditions that long antedate it. And that the tendency of contemporary, a certain type of contemporary history to precisely to isolate and personalize and view in a kind of Manichaean type of isolation, these phenomena completely paves the way for their return. Because you don't understand at all how they could mobilize their power. And it's only by making the connection. This is not to say that Kant is a predecessor of fascism. I hope that's clear. But in a certain, because Kant, more than almost any other philosopher, allows the contradictions to emerge of this tradition, but he is still indebted to a notion of form, which I believe feeds into this notion of Gestalt, which itself is not reducible to military masses, which contributes to it. Taken literally, a Gestalt is that which is set into place. It is gestellt in German. To set something in place, however, requires, first of all, a movement of setting, and second of all, a stable place into which that setting can come to rest. To the extent to which that which is thereby set into place is considered to be constituted independently of the process of setting in general, it can become a model or paradigm for a notion of self-identity that can be applied to subjects as well as to objects, to collectives as well as to individuals. In this case, the process of Gestaltung, which is the German equivalent of artistic creation, shaping, is indeed the heir to the theological connotations of the English word. The artist, by the way, there are thoughts in this direction very much developed by Lacour, Labarre, Nancy, in their little booklet, The Nazi Myth. Some of you may be familiar with the relation between a notion of aesthetic creation and what he calls national aestheticism in other places. And de Man also has similar thoughts in other essays. The artist and a fortiori his or her artwork are both considered to be what they are above and beyond their spatial, temporal existence and manifestation, which in turn is regarded as a function of the pre-existing essence of the artist, one forgets or overlooks the dynamic process of being set into place, or the extent to which that multiplicity that is then fixed into a uniform unity and takes on the appearance of being self-contained. And I believe, I don't make this clear enough in this version of the paper, that Riefenstahl's emphasis on movement and the Nazi emphasis also on movement, in part tries to emphasize the process of Gestaltung rather than taking for granted the Gestalt. For example, the biologism of Nazi racial ideology then sees that as a kind of fulfillment of a predetermined sort of natural given. So you still have a process of Gestaltung that involves struggle and conquest and violence, but it's governed, as it were, by a kind of national teleology, which is that underlies the notion of race. It is this complicity and its promotion through traditional aesthetics, I believe, that Walter Benjamin had in mind when, at the end of his essay on the work of art, he associated the aestheticization of politics with fascism. What he meant by that often quoted phrase emerges more clearly, however, when it is related to another passage, one which introduces the final section of his essay, but which has not received the attention I believe it deserves. Benjamin's phrase, one could say, has served as a screen memory to block out the context from which it draws its significance. Here now is the passage I'm referring to, and that's quote 5 on your sheet. Benjamin writes, "The increasing proletarianization of people today and the increasing formation of masses are two sides of one and the same occurrence. Fascism seeks to organize the newly developed proletarian masses without touching the property relations they seek to do away with. Fascism sees its salvation in allowing the masses to express themselves, or giving them expression, but not to have what is rightfully theirs. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to grant them self-expression by conserving those relations. Consequently, fascism leads to the aestheticizing of political life. All efforts to aestheticize politics culminate in one point: war." Although Benjamin nowhere in this essay mentions the films of Leni Riefenstahl, he refers instead to the Wochenschau, the weekly film news. Much of what he describes throughout his text, and in particular in these passages, is epitomized by her films, and nowhere more perhaps than in Triumph of the Will. Benjamin, author of a seminal text, a fragment, entitled Capitalism as Religion, in this published article, links fascism with the religious promise of salvation of the masses. Fascism finds salvation in granting the masses self-expression, but only insofar as this expression can be linked to the conservation of existing property relations. This in turn entails what could be called, Benjamin does not call it so, I would call it the hypostasis of identity structures. People are what they are by birth, by culture, by nature, by race. And they should be then permitted to express what they are in their identity, themselves, but not to change themselves, rather to fulfill themselves through self-expression. In a footnote to this passage, Benjamin cites the enormous influence of the weekly film news, the Wochenschau, in providing such self-expression, above all through its images of masses in political and sporting events, monster rallies, etc. Such hypostases of existing self-identity, sporting event, by the way, is a good example. You go to a sporting event as a partisan, to identify with the team in general, and to sometimes an incredibly violent degree. Such hypostases of existing self-identity is closely related to the process of isolation as described by Freud, and its privileged medium is that of screen memories, but also what I am calling here the aesthetic Gestalt, insofar as such forms and figures are presented as being essentially self-identical and immediately meaningful and intelligent. Literally meaningful, full of meaning. To look at them is to understand immediately what they mean. There's no need to look elsewhere, much less to think of their relations to anything that does not immediately appear. One particularly significant form of this Gestalt, involving the self-expression of the masses, can be seen in precisely those blocks of marches, seen from above, from what Benjamin, in the same long note, calls the bird's perspective, Vogelperspektive. The pure immanence and self-identity of this, a perspective which Riefenstahl often uses. In fact, she constructed special cranes in order to be able to take shots from above, looking down, as well as looking up, and so on. The pure immanence and self-identity of this mass, which makes it an ideal figuration of the kind of identity required by bourgeois and capitalist property relations under fascism, namely an identity that is above all considered to be homogeneous in the sense of owing nothing to anything foreign or alien to its immediate history. All of this is figured by and in the closed, compact formations of faceless and yet highly mobile marches. The mass is moving with direction and purpose. It has a goal, and that's also why it needs and depends on a leader, Führer, to lead it toward the goal. And its compactness suggests that it will be impervious to any outside influence. In this sense, the expression, Ausdruck, that Benjamin associates both with fascism and with capitalism presupposes some similar sort of internal immanent identity that pre-exists contact with the outside world and can therefore be literally expressed, pushed outward, as it were, but not constituted by its relation to the outside world. In their footnote to this passage already mentioned, Benjamin provides a valuable hint concerning another aspect of the expressivity that he attributes to fascism, and in particular to its use of images in film. And this is the last short quote on your sheet, 6. In the great parades, the monstrous meetings, in the mass events, sporting events, or in war, which today are all performed in order to be recorded by the camera, the mass looks itself in the face. In German, sieht die Masse sich selbst ins Gesicht. In view of the rest of the scene, in which Hitler descends from the plane to the jubilation of the massed bystanders, the question of the face as the object of self-expression can be described more precisely. For there are multiple kinds of faces, the jubilant, ecstatic, but still multiple faces of those gathered to welcome Hitler with a fascist salute, among which many women, and the face of the Führer, calm, almost shy, as he descends from the plane, overwhelmed by the welcome he receives. In the automobile that takes him from airport into town, there are repeated shots from a camera in back of Hitler, where one sees not his face, but the back of his head, with the hand raised in this characteristic salute, a kind of silhouette. The clouds have long since dispersed in order to make way for this procession of the bright sunlight. But what seems crucial here, and relevant to Benjamin's notion of expression, is the interaction of the mass of spectators with their leader, whose face and figure sum up the kind of expression that is to be granted to the masses in order to perpetuate existing property relations and at the same time give them the sense of possible salvation. Those relations require a notion of the subject capable of owning property, which means ultimately capable of staying the same over time, in control of oneself, and thereby capable of existing as a distinct owner of what is proper to them. Properties in the dual sense of the word, involving the lawful possession of things and objects, as well as possession of one's own faculties and actions. the tightly knit ranks of spectators and the erect figure of their one and only leader can claim to resolve the question of multiplicity and unity, of transience and duration. As Rudolf Hess will put it in one of his speeches during the Congress, Adolf Hitler is Germany and Germany is Hitler. But why then should war be the beginning and end of the fascist aestheticization of politics, as Benjamin argues? Why should violence be involved? Chapter 7 of Riefenstahl's film gives us at least a partial answer. And maybe we can look at that now. It's not chapter 7, sorry, it's chapter 10, section 10. Section 10. It begins with the same image. Interesting, by the way, I haven't had a chance to do this, but extremely interesting and illuminating to compare whatever the German Wochenschau did at the time, assuming they had sort of somewhat similar images of the voice off saying, here, Adolf Hitler, marching and so on, with Wochenschau. The clip recalls the beginning of the film. First, a black screen, short, soon followed by the eagle perched on the swastika, which then fades, this time, however, into a long central alley, through which, from on high at a great distance, seen from a great distance, the three tiny figures of Hitler, flanked by Himmler and Victor Lutzer, with their backs, and in turn, advance through rows and rows of SA and SS troops, 120,000 in all, toward an uncertain goal that in the next shot will be revealed as a burning flame, honoring German soldiers killed in the First World War. As the most direct confrontation of the political rally with death, this is also the most solemn moment of the 4 days, leading up to speeches by Hitler and Lutzer, in which the elimination of Worm and all of his leadership will be justified, the killing of the leadership, execution. And at the same time, the SA as organization will be exonerated of its leadership's guilt. They were accused of preparing a putsch against Hitler. What is expressed on this occasion is nothing less than the will to triumph not only over the enemy, in this case actually the internal enemy of the world leadership of the SA, but I believe over death itself. By killing Wurm and his comrades, the German rebirth is to be assured. Killing and the military, in the form of the SS and the Reichswehr, will pave the way to eternal life, to the 1,000-year Reich. The commemoration of fallen comrades thus goes hand in hand with the celebration of death that, as the result of killing, is treated as the product of an intentional act, one that can be deliberately inflicted, and by implication, therefore, deliberately overcome, if not avoided. War, as organized, collective, and purposive killing, makes death into what it has been considered to be ever since the book of Genesis, and also since the death of Christ, namely, the result of human action, whether as punishment for transgression, the original sin, or for betrayal. By acting in a manner that seems to make death into a product of human actions, politics in general, and fascist politics in particular, but not only, seek to make good on the Pauline promise quoted by Hobbes in his Leviathan, quote, that since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. 1 Corinthians 15, quoted by Hobbes. Also, to be sure, for Paul, that resurrection had first to be the work of a very particular man, namely he who was also the Son of God. And this is precisely the difference that separates Christianity from fascism. For the latter, it is the semi-divine, Führer, or Duce, who must assure the overcoming of death to the problematic but essential equation of people with messianic leader. The leader is an individual whose individually both sets him apart from, isolates, and at the same time makes him the expression of a collective that can now be construed as a homogeneous individual, members of the same race, of the same culture, of the same nation. This collective is modeled on the individual in the literal sense of being thought of as being homogeneous and indivisible. The individual can thus hope to live on in the collective, which in the case of Nazism understands itself as the bodily, fleshly continuation of its individual members through the continuity of blood. But this in turn requires the collective, the race, people, or nation, to close ranks in a dense and closed fashion, to quote the Horst Wessel song, in order to exclude all pollution and contamination from external and alien sources. This is the biopolitical version of the nation, modeled after the unshakable, invulnerable individual. And this individual is manifested as an object of faith and belief in the figure of the Führer, in the Führer as Gestalt, and in the Gestalt as Führer. The ideal of an indivisible, invulnerable, and ultimately immortal collective, symbolized in the stone eagle, but more generally also in the figure of the fasces, or that of the swastika, can only exercise political appeal to the extent that it can claim to control anxiety by giving it direction. The figure functions in this film often as a Markstein, a stone marker, directing the gaze and allowing it finally to set itself in place and to come to rest. In other words, allowing it to focus. The great obstacle to such focusing is, of course, death. The flame, framed and controlled by stone, and by stone-like troops, is one way of focusing on death, which then becomes a transition to eternal life. This absorption of death into life as a moment of transition continues a motif, therefore, as old in Western culture as the Bible and as the Christian salvational narrative. But the absorption of death into life also implies a transcending of finitude, which in certain political and historical contexts can converge with the rejection of heterogeneity. It's only when the origin is thus purified and made self-identical that the end that awaits all living beings, qua singular beings, can be represented not as an interruption, but as a fulfillment. Only then can death lose its sting. An essential component of this project is, I've argued, the representation of death as a result of human action, as a result of intentional activity. It is this that makes war a privileged medium of politics through which the political collective finds salvational self-expression. War legitimates killing, and in so doing makes death into a sacrificial moment of rebirth. But it is above all the death of the other that is here intended. Carl Schmitt's theory of the friend-enemy grouping as the origin of the political demonstrates its Christian origins, except that it is never humanity as a whole that is saved, but only a particular people, nation, or race, a self opposed to other selves, and this means opposed to other peoples, other nations, as well as individuals. But these others are nowhere to be seen in this film. They are screened out to begin with by the clouds into which and through which the plane descends on its way to its destination. Like the clouds in the opening scene, which are framed in the window of the plane. The clouds themselves into which the plane disappears, if only to exit on the other side, emblematize the transitions from one shot to the next through fading and overlaps. Such frequent fade-outs and fade-ins establish the cinematic sequence, giving it an underlying continuity of movement that is characteristic of Riefenstahl. This does not exclude the sharp cut, the fade to black, which emphasizes contrast and discontinuity, but it does highlight the continuity of the overall progression. It's this continuity which includes and absorbs the radical breaks that mark the German rebirth, linking the aestheticism of Riefenstahl's film to the violence of Nazi politics. It is, however, a violence that Nazi leaders assume and even flaunt. But in order to assert the perennial character of the new order, they are in the process of imposing. The sinuous rhythms of Riefenstahl's traveling shots constitute the cinematic correlative of the immortality implied in the idea of the 1,000-year Reich. The aim of conquering new Lebensraum by military force is the spatial condition of this promised extension of Lebenszeit. The clouds to which the plane descends to Earth are the movable gestalt that mark the trajectory of this promise, a theological promise brought down to political Earth. That's the end of this section. Now I have a short section, which I realize has been going on for a while, but that will take us now to 9/11. Let me now finally return, by way of historical contrast, to the images mentioned at the outset, which involve a very different set of clouds. Due to the massive media coverage that commemorated, often at the expense of serious analysis, the attacks of September 11, 2001, I can assume that the general image of those clouds are sufficiently present to everyone here, and that's therefore not necessary to project a video of them yet another time. Instead, I want to show you these clouds from another angle, a less familiar vantage point and a less familiar photograph. The photograph was taken by Thomas Höpke, a senior figure in the renowned Magnum Photographers Cooperative. Höpke chose not to publish it in 2001, and he also excluded it from a book of Magnum pictures taken that day and published shortly thereafter. Once you've seen it, you will probably understand immediately why. Okay? Take a good look. It is clear that at the time, you can all see it? It's clear that at the time, without explanation and discussion, this image was in its own way, perhaps even more shocking than those of the destruction itself and its after effects. Without getting into that discussion, which, however, is well documented on the internet, and if you Google the name of Thomas Hoepker, Hoepker, you'll find a great deal of information and discussion of this photo on the net. So without getting into the details of that discussion, the photo, however one interprets or judges its content, tells us something about the relation of asceticism, terror, and terrorism that even, and perhaps especially today, remains relevant and pertinent. As I've emphasized, an image is often considered to be aesthetic in the traditional sense of that term, insofar as it is seen to be well-formed, gestaltet, that is to say, self-contained, meaningful. This in turn implies that it can and perhaps should be viewed at a certain distance, which is required if it is to be apprehended as a unified whole, as a gestalt. The position of the beholder, the viewer, the spectator, is thereby defined as a protected position at a distance. It is stable and self-contained. This is why even most videos and images of catastrophes broadcast regularly on nightly TV news, reported on in newspapers, can generally be consumed with the morning breakfast or the evening dinner without great disturbance. As long as the destruction or maiming of, let's say, individual human or animal bodies are not shown in too great detail, as long as they're shown from a distance. The clouds of smoke rising above burning buildings and people must be kept at that distance, and if possible, be integrated into a portrayal involving distinct shapes and gestalt. Everything can thus be taken in, apprehended, as parts of a whole that in turn is assumed to be transparently intelligible, immediately understandable, in the sense that it poses no further questions, requires no inquiry beyond the frame of what is shown. The integrity and meaningfulness of the whole is guaranteed often by the voice off of the reporter or by the captions of the newspaper picture. Such voice-off or captions tell readers and viewers what to think about what they see, and at the same time to consider what they think to be the direct and exclusive emanation or expression or property of the image. The destruction of objects and persons is thus made consumable because meaningful. Death and destruction affects others from whom one is safely separated and protected. One can get up and walk away from the aesthetic image, which is thus isolated. This, at least, is its most traditional quality, and it is what makes it eminently suitable to serve as screen memory or to be forgotten and replaced by the next isolated image or set of images. Now, about the people in the picture's foreground, New York Times columnist Frank Rich wrote at the time, the, quote, "Young people in Mr. Hoepker's photo aren't necessarily callous, they're just American." This was hotly contested at the time, including by one of the people who was in that photo. Whether this statement accurately describes the people in the photo or not, it no doubt is accurate concerning the impression that the photo transmitted to most viewers. This is one of detached and indeed carefree observers relaxing in the sun, while far in the distance, black clouds of smoke rise in the sky. The photo, like all photos, is what in German is called a Momentaufnahme, or in French, an instantané, a snapshot, a moment or instant isolated from everything happening before, after, and outside of its frame. Frank Rich, who is really one of the most interesting journalistic writers I think you can read, made, I believe, a very severe mistake, however, in referring to what he called the young people in the photograph. Since this could easily be taken, and was taken, probably was meant, to apply to the young people themselves, rather than the figures in the photograph. Understood as a statement about the photograph, rather than young people in it. However, the statement strikes at precisely, I believe, what made the attacks of September 11th so traumatic for United States Americans. Not, however, for many others, but certainly for residents and particularly United States Americans. For this was the first time, at least since the Civil War, that a massive attack had been carried out on American soil. And the first time in even longer that such an attack had originated from outside the United States. Although this is, by the way, debated. There are theories that, as you probably know, that believe it's a conspiracy that was orchestrated by the military, by the CIA, by the neocons, and so on. What was, and in a certain sense still is, characteristically American, at any rate, is the belief in the safety that that distance can procure, coupled with the belief in the moral superiority of the nation that deems itself so protected. It was, and in a sense still is, the belief in the efficacy of isolation. The response to these attacks, wars against Iraq, Afghanistan, terrorism, Patriot Acts, increasing of both policing internal and military policing external, suspension of all sorts of legal rights. This response was, of course, anything but isolationist. And as you may or may not know, the Libertarian candidate for the Republican nomination is actually the only one of any of the candidates who is against the military intervention in external wars out of and so on. So this tradition is still very strong. But the justification of this response was and still is based on the belief that a real enemy, an external enemy, can be isolated, named, depicted, located, and destroyed, mainly by military and police means. The frightful discovery by Americans that they were not or no longer safe at home unleashed an anxiety that was swiftly channeled by being given an identifiable, perceptible object, a Gestalt, or a series of Gestalt. And 9/11, as it came to be called, became the sign that corresponded to that Gestalt. Both a call for help, I'm sure you know, 9/11 is a number you dial when you need help, sort of official help, and a name for the act itself. Interesting, this convergence there. What makes the photo so powerful and so shocking, I believe, is the nonchalance, the carefree and relaxed attitude it seems to depict. At the very moment when the grounds that previously supported that attitude, are literally being consumed in the background. I had an association with this that I don't know if anybody else has, but that for me would fit into this historically. I associated with advertising images in the 40s and 50s in the United States after the Second World War. And that was the point where this sense of omnipotence, having gone through that war and come out victorious, and the sense of a kind of collective safety was in a way strongest, because it was before the fear of the enemy was crystallized in the Red Purges, in the Cold War, in the international communist conspiracy, and so on. There was a moment there from 1945 to the early 50s in which you saw advertisements sort of that reminded, this reminds me of, I have to go back and Google and see what I can come up with. It's all, available there. But that's what it reminds me of, the advertisement sort of I grew up with as a child there after the war. The background, however, is no longer, and that's after 9/11, is no longer simply isolatable from the foreground. It is this that I believe is ultimately terrifying, and that the construction of a war against terror seeks to channel outward, directing it mainly against foreigners not allowed to enter American territory, Guantanamo, and so on, from whom one can therefore hope to distance oneself, and through isolation ultimately identify and destroy. It's interesting to note, however, that the word terror in English still describes first and foremost an emotional response to an uncontrollable danger, an extreme state of anxiety, a fear of losing oneself, a panic. The declaration, therefore, of a war against terror attempts to distract and to distance this and to exploit this feeling by giving it an object of identification, by turning terror into terrorism and then into terrorists. Very important. In your title, you put the ism in brackets, you know. And I think there's a very important shift between terror, terrorism, and terrorist there in this context. Terrorists can then be portrayed as external figures and movements that can be identified and ultimately eliminated. But the clouds of rubble released by the collapse of the Twin Towers tell also a different story. Here then my last photo, taken from the video that I'm sure you've all seen many times. And you can really, we should show the video, because I know everybody has seen this 100 times, of the, you know, the cloud moving rapidly and then totally immersing, you know, the camera basically, and totally destroying visibility, as it were. These clouds that strangely resemble the clouds to which the plane flies in triumph of the will, no longer, however, mark the passage to a mobilized gestalt that characterized the Nazi rally in politics. It marks what only came a decade later to Nazi Germany. It marks the pulverization of the Gestalt, and with it, of the civilization based on its maintenance through terror. The clouds of rubble that rushed toward the spectators and cameras and finally engulfed them could have been understood as a sign calling us to rethink the policies and strategies of identification through isolation that produced these clouds in the first place. Instead, as we have had occasion to see in the recent commemoration of this event in the United States in the past weeks, the demand for consolation and safety remains uppermost, preventing any serious critical questioning of the relationships that the politics of isolation and identification continue to systematically exclude, including, for instance, any sort of reflection on the possible relation of 9/11 to other historical events, not least of all that other September 11th, this time in 1973, when the democratically elected government of Chile was overthrown by an American instigated coup d'etat, or a reflection on the possible relation of the attacks against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the financial and military symbol of the United States global power, to the position taken by successive U.S. governments on, for instance, the Palestine-Israel conflict, or countless other events. When Nobel Prize-winning economist and New York Times contributor Paul Krugman dared to publish a blog entitled Years of Shame in the New York Times, as an op-ed, short op-ed, in which he argued that the memory of September 11, 2001 had been irrevocably poisoned in being made into a justification for the wars against Iraq and Afghanistan, he provoked a huge backlash. And in the discussions that I heard in the commemorations of September 11th in the American media, it was constantly repeated how many people died in the World Trade Center. No mention I saw being made of 1 million dead in Iraq, I don't know how many dead in Afghanistan, etc., etc. One of the more civil replies, many of the replies were absolutely terrifying in their aggressivity, obscenity, threats, and so on to Krugman, was by one Michael Netz, who wrote, "Mr. Krugman, I feel no shame about my personal recollections and commemorations of 9/11. I remain grateful for the words of comfort that President George W. Bush and Mayor Rudolph W. Giuliani provided the nation in the aftermath." And in the utter disorientation that followed those clouds, that swallowed up all figures and forms for a moment, covering them with a white covering of dust as they slowly receded, the need for words of comfort could be understood. but that this need has persisted and tended to disqualify all critique of the militarized and police response that followed as disloyal to the memory of the U.S. and Allied soldiers, much less their victims, killed, maimed physically and psychologically, and hence as essentially traitorous. This strikes me as not so very different from the passage through the clouds above Nuremberg in 1934, revealing the compact gestalt of the militant masses on the march. The movement of mobilization may well comfort and console, but it requires concomitant militarization and mobilization of terror in order, in the phrase that sums up the spirit of the age today, in order to continue moving forward. We must always move forward, never looking back. But this march forward is not just pursued by the clouds it seeks with limited success to mobilize. It is also inevitably overtaken by them. And when those clouds finally come down to earth, no war and no military can escape them. Thank you for your patience.